Welcome, everyone. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'll be the host of today's interview. If you don't already follow us, please follow us. And if you take any photos of today's evening, tag us so that we see what you find most interesting. I will welcome our special guest. Linda K. Jacobs holds a PhD in Near Eastern archaeology and anthropology and spent many years working on archaeological excavations and economic development projects in the Middle East. Dr. Jacobs is committed to promoting Middle Eastern culture and knowledge in the United States, founding Kalima Press in 2011, and sitting on the board of several Middle Eastern organizations, including the Near East Foundation, the Moise Khairallah Center, and all four of her grandparents were members of the New York Syrian colony. Linda's author of 2 books published by Kalima Press and is at work on a study of all Syrian colonies in the United States. Actually, 3 books, excuse me, 3 books. And we are honored to have you be a part of this conversation. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mikey. It's great to be here.
It is an honor to have you. So, as I mentioned, you've published 3 books. We're going to be focusing on 2 of them, Strangers No More and Strangers in the West, both of which focus on the quote-unquote Syrian colony in the United States. And I'd love to, before we sort of jump right into that, I want to talk about this first book that focuses on the Syrian colony in New York, which was in a very specific part in New York, in what we could call Little Syria in the Lower West Side.
Right.
I'm curious, growing up, having these 4 grandparents who are part of this colony, what was your relationship to the Lower West Side or the Syrian colony, Little Syria?
Well, you've hit a really, really important and kind of a sore point in the historiography of the New York colony, because having 4 grandparents who were part of this colony on the Lower West Side, I knew nothing about it. They never talked about it. They never mentioned it. I didn't know that there was a colony in Manhattan. And in fact, the only colony I knew about was the Brooklyn colony, which everyone called Little Syria, and along the spine of Atlantic Avenue, which is still a kind of center in Brooklyn. And it wasn't until long after my grandmother died that I remembered something that she had told me when she was quite old. She told me that she traveled from Brooklyn to Manhattan for 2 reasons. One, to roll cigarettes in a Syrian cigarette factory. And the second reason she went was to have an abortion because she had gotten pregnant by her husband too quickly after her first 2 children were born. And she was afraid that she would not be able to take care of the new child. And so she went to the Lower West Side, where the midwife lived, the Syrian midwife, to have an abortion. And it didn't strike me at the time because I had no context for thinking about the Lower West Side as being a place where the Syrians were living. But when I began to research it, I realized, putting the dates together and putting the presence of the midwives and where they were living at the time, realized that she had gone to see the Orthodox midwife who was still on the Lower West Side in order to have the abortion. And those were the only 2 hints that I had from my grandmother about the Lower West Side colony and the presence of the Syrians there in the 19th and early 20th century. Otherwise, my parents, for example, who were born in Brooklyn, only talked about Brooklyn and the Syrian presence, the Syrian-Lebanese presence in Brooklyn. So it was a complete mystery to me. And the reason I wrote the book is because no one knew about it, and no one had written about the Lower West Side colony ever.
So I want to talk about this word colony, because for me, it's a striking word. Did they think of themselves as a colony? This is a colony? Or is this a word that we use sort of retrospectively? This is the most apt word that you could use to describe this community. It's not you're not saying the Syrian community or the Syrian neighborhood. Colony is there's a verb, colonize, or to build a colony. Why is that word sort of most appropriate?
Because it's what the American newspapers called it. They called it either the Syrian quarter or the Syrian colony. It was not exclusively Syrian. There were many, many Irish. There were many German. There were Slavs. There were Scandinavians. It was a very multicultural part of town, even in the 19th century when the Syrians were numerous. But American newspapers called it the Syrian colony. And the Syrians did as well, occasionally. But I think that they took that from this outside view of themselves as a colony, or as, and they were clustered. This is actually, I would say this is my map, and this is my black lines. And I would say that it's even a little bit smaller than what I had written at the time, that I thought at the time. And I think it was even a little bit more condensed. So if you think of, let's say 900 people living in 3 blocks, within 3 blocks of each other on Washington Street, it was extremely and intensely occupied. And they lived mostly on the eastern side of the street, so even more clustered in places. So there is a tenement house at 2527, which I think, Mikey, this one, which was a double tenement. You can tell by the address, 2527 Washington Street, on the eastern side of the street. It was exclusively Syrian. There were 150 Syrians living in this building in 1897 when this picture was taken. So they were very visible to anyone who came down there. Yeah. They weren't visible to New York in general. They were too small. They were too self-contained. But if you walked down there, you saw signs in Arabic, you saw menus in Arabic, you heard people on the street speaking Arabic, and there were still people, you can't see it in this picture, but there are other pictures, there were still men who were wearing a fez, even on the streets of New York in the 19th century and into the 20th century. So it was very, very intensely Arab.
So I want to talk about the dates, and then I want to dive deeper into the fabric of that neighborhood and that colony. So the dates on the title of the book are 1880 to 1900. And that's this sort of deep, intense wave of migration. But as I was reading, I realized that there was this fact about American history that I didn't know about. And that is sort of this roadblock or this pothole in your research that you had to sort of dodge, that the 1890 census federally was burned. That's somehow right. There's no 1890 census.
That's right.
How did you do this research? How did you figure out who these people are when this very important document that typically you would be able to sort of rely on? So how did you build these numbers?
So I did it really by main strength. I did it one name at a time. I really did. I looked, first I started with the 1900 census, which does exist. And the 1900 census was the first census in which the term Syrian was used, as opposed to Turkey in Asia or Turkey in Europe, which is what had been used before. There were still census takers who used the old-fashioned term, so one had to look at every name that had Turkey next to it as well. And then you could look at every name that had Greece next to it, because people got the Ottoman Empire kind of mixed up and they didn't know where people were from. So I used the 1900 census and worked my way back from that. So first I looked up every name I found every name in the 1900 census in all of those categories. And then I did a search for them in every resource that was possible. For example, on Ancestry, you could look at city directories. On Fold3, you could look at military records. On Family Search, you could look at birth certificates. And I happened to live in New York, so I was at the municipal archives every single day, looking up birth certificates, looking up death certificates, looking up marriage certificates. And from those, of course, there was always a witness for naturalization, for marriage, a best man or a witness for the city. And then those people, and they were already always Syrians as well. And so those people would be added to the database.
Yeah.
There is a fragmentary, unfortunately for us, a fragmentary police census that was done in 1890 in New York City. And it is not a very good source because it only gives the name, the age of the person, the gender, and the address of where they lived. And if it had been complete for our neighborhood, it would have been an invaluable source. But it was that film, that microfilm for that ward, which is the first ward, is incomplete. So there were only 95 names on that list. But
yeah,
they were still names and still proving that someone was there in 1890 already. So,
okay, so I want to talk about. I'm going to jump around a bunch because there are going to be questions in the chat afterwards that dive a little deeper. I want to talk about this unbelievable family. Okay, so this photo, for those of you who can't see the screen, in English, written at the bottom of this photo in cursive, beautifully, it says, "The first and only Syrian family in the United States, in the US." Who are the Arbeelys? And why are they branding themselves the first Syrian family in the United States?
Because they were telling the truth. So I just want to say that on the Moïse Kharallah website is a story map and kind of interactive story on this family that I wrote, and the Moïse Kharallah Center put it up and did all of the technical work. So that is the most complete group biography of this family that you can find right now. But this is one of those just incredible documents. This is the Arbeely family. They were born, Yusuf Arbeely and his wife, Mary Durrani, were born in just outside of Damascus. And they left in 1860 when all of that conflict was going on with the Druze. And they went to Beirut and spent 18 years in Beirut. Yusuf Arbeely helped to what they call vocalize the Arabic Bible. And vocalize means to add the vowels into the Arabic script. And he was a teacher at the Orthodox Girls' College. He ran an Orthodox school in a small town. He was one of the intellectual kind of Western affiliated elite, and his two of his sons went to what was then called Syrian Protestant College, which is now called American University of Beirut, both of whom got medical degrees from Syrian Protestant College. They belonged to one of the elite Masonic lodges in Beirut as well, called Le Liban Lodge. And they came to the United States after trying to go other places. They tried to go to Russia. They tried to go to a couple of other places, and they ended up getting letters of recommendation and possibly a job in the United States. And so they traveled in 1878 to New York, stopping on their way at the World's Fair, the Exposition Universelle in Paris, and then coming to New York. And Yusuf, the father, got a job teaching Arabic at Maryville College, which was a Presbyterian college in Maryville, Tennessee. And if there's anyone on this call from Maryville or Knoxville, anywhere close to Maryville, the gravestone of Mary Durrani, who died 2 years after they arrived, is in the Maryville, in the New Providence Cemetery in Maryville, Tennessee. 3 of the kids were born in Damascus, 3 born in Beirut. There was actually a daughter as well, but she died before they got on the ship to come to the United States. She's not in this picture because she had just died about a month before this photograph was taken. And they ended up in Maryville, Tennessee. So Yusuf taught Arabic. Abraham, the oldest boy who's in this picture on the upper left, standing, who was a doctor, set up a practice in Texas, where he went to find a better environment to live in. They didn't really like Tennessee. They thought it was a little bit too small town. They didn't like the climate very much. There was not much employment to be had because it was a kind of poor state.
Sorry to interrupt, but why did they leave New York to begin with?
They had, Yusuf had a job in
Oh,
Maryville.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. He had a job at the university or some
Yeah.
education.
And
Okay.
the Crawfords, who were founders of the college, had a connection to some of the Presbyterian missionaries in Beirut. And so they read these letters of recommendations and hired Yusuf on the basis of these letters that Yusuf had gotten from the Presbyterian missionaries
Yeah.
in Beirut. And so, and that's why they went. Yeah.
But
Go ahead.
aside from them being the first, they're also unbelievably accomplished. So they start what I think is the first Arabic language newspaper in the United States. They're also highly educated. They're performers. They go all over the place. They're doctors and lawyers and dentists. And so I guess my question to you, as I sort of go through these slides and show some of these images, my question is, did the colony in New York revere the Arbeelys? Did they have a relationship with the actual community in New York? Were they sort of celebrities among the community, or is this just something that we think about retrospectively?
Yeah, so I shouldn't say everyone, people did acknowledge that they were the first family to come, yes. Mm-hmm. But no, they weren't revered. They were caught up in they were Orthodox. They were caught up in the sectarian battles. Their newspaper, which was founded by the oldest son, Abraham, and the fourth son, Naguib, Arbeely. And Naguib ran the day-to-day operations because Abraham was a doctor and he lived mostly in Washington, D.C. And Naguib the newspaper started out as being kind of non-sectarian. It was the only Arabic newspaper in the New World. And so they talked about non-sectarian things. They talked about orthodoxy. They talked about the Maronite church. They talked about people having meetings, and they didn't care who they talked about. They wanted people to know about the Syrian colony in New York. And you can see for the first year, they even had an English language page, which I find kind of hilarious, because I can't imagine who in the world would be reading an Arabic newspaper in English in New York City. I just find it hilarious. And clearly nobody was interested in the English page, and it disappeared after about a year. But once other newspapers started happening, which started in 1894, the first issue of Kawkab was in 1892. But in about 1894, there were other newspapers that started to be published, and each had a sectarian slant. And so Kawkab became more and more orthodox, and Naguib especially became more and more strident in his orthodoxy. And so he was not a friend to many of the people of the colony, and the colonists, many of the colonists, especially the Maronites, didn't like him very much. So there were these battles, these internecine battles that went on that culminated in 1906 with the murder of a Maronite man in the colony by what they thought were two Orthodox men. And there was a huge trial that went on for months and months and months. And it was a farce because no one spoke English. The interpreters were not very good in English, and they couldn't explain the concepts to the judge or the lawyers. The lawyers couldn't talk anything but English. And the men were acquitted because there was just too much chaos. And they never found who did it, but it was kind of the boiling point of these internecine conflicts in the colony.
So let's talk about this term that you use in the book, this idea of sort of social geography, which is what you're attempting to do in the first book. So walk us through some of the anchors, the institutional anchors of this neighborhood, and what life may have been like for some of these families. Okay,
I'm going to work my way backwards, come to this in a minute. Their lives were horrible. They lived in these converted they were from the first quarter of the 19th century. They had been beautiful townhouses for the wealthy of Manhattan, and they abandoned them in the 1840s and 1850s. German and Irish immigrants came in, and these townhouses were converted to tenements. So they were about 20 feet wide, maybe 140 feet deep, that had been meant for a single family with possibly servants' quarters in the attic, federal style townhouses that were broken up into these tiny, tiny rooms with no light, no windows, no ventilation, no indoor plumbing, nothing. And this is from actually a little bit later, the picture on the upper left from 1914 of a hallway sink with cold water, the only plumbing that was installed in the first decade of the 20th century in these tenements. There were privies in the back in these shacks. So you had to walk down 5 or 6 flights of stairs with no electricity in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. The tuberculosis was rampant in these communities. The child mortality rate was extremely high. If you leaf through the death certificates of the colony in the 19th century and the early 20th century, you find death certificate after death certificate of these children dying from cholera, dying from tuberculosis, and dying from what they called marasmus, which was a term I didn't know. And it's just really malnutrition.
Are these things that were only true of the Lower West Side colony, as it was also true in Brooklyn, or this is just what city life was like for poor immigrants?
It was what all of the ghettos, all of the slums were like in New York in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And there were movements to try to change the tenements, to mandate light and air, but none of them affected what had already been built. They only affected the new buildings that were being built as tenements. These buildings, which were built in the 1840s, were not affected. So the only way to get out of this life was to move out of the colony. And people started doing that by 1900. The Syrians, about a quarter of the Syrian presence in New York was already in Brooklyn. Because in Brooklyn, you could get more space for less money. There were parks, there were trees, there were better schools, and it was just a better environment. So,
and just to give us some numbers, between 1880, so the Arbeely show up, family number one. By the peak, by 1900, was 1900 the peak for the Lower West Side?
No, because there were, until the First World War, they kept coming, and they were coming in bigger numbers after 1900. 1900 is just my cutoff date. So in 1900, there were, it's really hard to say again, but there were about 1,500 or 1,600 people, of whom a quarter were in Brooklyn, and the rest were on the Lower West Side. There were a couple of outliers in Staten Island, a few in Harlem, but basically in those two communities, in Brooklyn and in the Lower Manhattan. So
I'm gonna. I was joking with you before we started the call that for me, 2,000 people is like it's like a single apartment building now, right. And the idea that was the peak of this community that produced, that sort of laid the framework for what is now millions of a national community of millions and millions of people is so remarkable to me.
Yes, but again, after 1900, the numbers kept going up, and until the shipping embargo in 1914, and then of course the immigration quota laws in 1924, which reduced the allowable Syrian immigration into the United States to 100 per year, which was the minimum. You couldn't go below 100. So it was the least, the Syrians were one of the least desirable elements, according to the Immigration Restriction League and the Congress, for the United States by 1924. So that stopped Syrian immigration completely.
So was Syria after 1924, was that also, let's talk about the term Syrian, actually. This is maybe a good time to talk about that. So after, after 1923, at least in Lebanon, a lot of people started thinking about this idea of Greater Lebanon and not Bilad al-Sham. So were immigrants from what is now modern day Lebanon after the 20s also considered within that 100-person quota?
Yes, they were still called Syrians by the Immigration Service, and they were still called Syrians by Congress. So yeah, that was a unit, so 100 total. And
interesting.
And then there were some loosenings of that law so that people who had relatives in the United States or people had certain skills, things changed through the years. But it wasn't until Lyndon Johnson that quota was completely removed.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about the economics, for the sort of economic nature of the community. Because when I think of Arab immigrants and Syrian immigrants in the Arab world, there is this idea of the prosperous peddler, the prosperous business person. And on the screen we have right now is the original Sahadi's grocery store, which anyone who's familiar with New York, and definitely in particular familiar with Brooklyn, knows is very familiar with the famous Sahadi's restaurant, grocery store on Atlantic Avenue now. But what did these immigrants do? Those that were actually in New York?
So there's a very, very strong pattern that is true in New York. That's not necessarily true in other colonies, but it is true in New York. Oh, this is the cover of my book, and this is the original of the cover of my book, which is just beautiful, I think. So they started out, these are generalizations, there were exceptions, but these are generalizations that generally hold true. They started out as peddlers. Men and women were peddlers. They peddled two kinds of goods which were defined by the Syrians themselves. And they were shorthandedly defined by the kind of thing that they carried them in. So the Keshahi peddlers were the notions peddlers. They carried their notions. Do people know what notions are?
No, if you could tell us what notions are, that'd be great.
Yeah, there are things that don't fit in other categories. So the needle and thread, little pairs of scissors, shoelaces. My mother used to say about her father that he was a shoelace peddler. Shoe polish, collars and cuffs, sometimes lace collars and cuffs, or just stiff collars that were that men wore, or sleeve garters. Anything that didn't really fit into other categories of things. That's what notions are. And they're always small, they're always cheap, and they're fairly light to carry. Although people said that the box often weighed 40 pounds.
Yeah.
And that sometimes they would carry a box on their front and an equally weighted box on their back. So 80 pounds that they would carry around, walking from house to house, selling these notions. Women carried notions as well, but they usually carried a basket. And then the other kind of peddler was the peddler of fancy goods or Oriental goods or Turkish goods, as they were called. And Turkish goods were what you can imagine: embroideries, Holy Land goods like rosaries, olive wood boxes, supposedly from the Mount of Olives in Palestine, that kind of thing. So they were peddlers first. Then they became suppliers of peddlers. And so that they would set up a warehouse and a store, and they would supply other peddlers with goods. Then they might become importers. Sahadi was an importer very early. When this picture was taken, which was in 1899, he was already importing his own private label arak. Yeah. And that's what you see on the shelves above his head. And just like Sahadi's today, he not only sold food in his grocery store, he sold, I'm using the Iranian word, no, shishe, what's the word for shishe, the water
shisha.
pipe?
Oh yeah, agile, yeah, shisha.
Hookah. Yeah, Nargile, right. They sold, brass lamps, whatever they need to sell. And if you go into Sahadi's on Atlantic Avenue, you see the same. You see all the foodstuffs, plus you see brass trays from the Middle East and that kind of thing. There were the usual other kinds of things. There were barbers, there were Syrian restaurants that served Syrian food, there were Syrian-run boarding houses, and importers like Sahadi and other people bringing in goods from the Middle East or even from Europe. Yeah. And then they became exporters and they started selling to South America, all with Syrian networks. So they had all of their Syrian relatives and friends in Mexico City, in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, in Cuba, in Argentina, in Brazil, all of these networks spreading out all over the world, and in Europe, from which they were importing. So George Forzly was the first banker in the colony. He was at 103 Washington Street. And he went bankrupt. He started his business in 1896 and went bankrupt in 1898. And he closed his doors, and all of his depositors came running to the bank trying to get their money out, and none of them could get their money out. And the Syrians all lost their money, including the Orthodox priest who had all of the congregation's money in the bank, and lost all of the congregation's money. It was a really tragic event. He never went into banking again. He never was a self-employed again. He always worked for other people. But a Maronite set of brothers named the Fawors started a bank in 1905, which was very successful and lasted just until the Depression, and then went bankrupt in the Depression.
Okay, so I have a couple questions. I want to talk about the sort of dynamic nature of this colony, insofar as how connected to the rest of the country, how much back and forth there was to other communities in the Midwest, in the South, in the West as well. But also import-export suggests that these families are also going back and forth to Syria.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes. So Kawkab America, the Arabic newspaper, had a column in every issue that was called Comings and Goings. And they just would say, so-and-so came from Syria, we welcome him to New York. So-and-so and his wife went to England, we wish them a good journey. So-and-so and so-and-so went to they would call any place outside of New York inland or to the States. Yeah. So-and-so is going inland to Albuquerque, New Mexico to look over his store there. Or so-and-so has just returned from the fair in San Francisco and he reports that he did very well. So just one line, and there was a column in every single issue. People traveled constantly. They traveled constantly. The Caribbean they traveled to the Caribbean all the time. There were not so many instances of people going to South America. They must have relied more on the mails and the telegraphs rather than actually traveling, but they went to the Caribbean all the time. My maternal grandfather came to the United States by way of Cuba. And so did many other people. It was a great stopping off place. There was a big colony there starting in the early 1890s. So, and in Haiti as well, and in Puerto Rico. Yeah, so they were everywhere. They were everywhere. My second book, which is on all of the colonies, they were in every state and territory, including Alaska.
Yeah, I love the table of contents of the book is for me it tickles me because it's just like every single state is listed on there. This may seem like a detour, but I'm curious about their entryway into sort of like upper society and the political and business class. Did that sort of wave of immigrants aspire to enter the political class? run for office, try to get on the school board?
For the most part, as far as I know, no. I know some examples. I mean, I'm writing about a group of men in the New York colony who worked together, and I won't give away my fire by telling you the plot. But one of them ran for state senate in Brooklyn twice, and the newspapers presented it as a kind of, as he was like a dark horse. The Democratic Party wanted someone, the Republican Party wanted a candidate to run in a solidly Democratic district. And they convinced this, almost fresh off the boat. I mean, he wasn't fresh off the boat. He'd had many businesses. He'd been there for 20 years already when he ran. But somehow they convinced him to run, and he lost decisively both times he ran. But he was active in local Brooklyn politics. There was a doctor in, now I'm forgetting where he was. I think he was in Birmingham, Alabama, who was active in local politics as well, ran for office a couple of times, lost both times, but continued to entertain politicians, write letters to every politician if he had an issue and that kind of thing. But there weren't very many people who aspired to American politics. You had to wait for the next generation, or even my generation, the third generation.
So can we talk a little bit about this this delightful story about the Arbeely who gets nominated for council or the consulate? Tell us a little bit about who this character is and what happens.
So this is Naguib Arbeely, the same man who started the newspaper.
Okay.
And he had a law degree from the University from Maryville College. And in those days, you didn't have to go to law school. You could get a law degree just by going to undergraduate school, which is what he did. He was said to speak 16 languages. It's probably an exaggeration, but he certainly spoke many languages. And you can tell this is his handwriting on the front and the back of this photograph. He wrote very well. He wrote beautiful English. His handwriting was beautiful. So he was very smart and very accomplished. He came when he was 9 years old. So he had most of his schooling in the United States. He decided that he wanted to be a consul in a Middle Eastern country. And he was, he was 20 years old. He was 21 years old when he decided this. He orchestrated his nomination to be consul. First, he tried to be consul to Egypt, but the president named someone else to be consul before he got his foot in the door.
What year are we talking about?
So he went to Jerusalem in 1885. So it must have been, so probably his effort to be he graduated in 1884. So in 1884 was the year that he tried to be consul to Egypt, and he was shut out by someone else. But in 1885, he moved to Washington, D.C. This is the amazing part. Before his older brother, Abraham, moved there. He moved there by himself. He stayed in a hotel. He gave performances, Orientalist performances, so he could make himself known. He got, as he called it, the entire Tennessee delegation. That means the 2 senators, all the congressmen from Tennessee, to write him letters of recommendation. And he indeed got the nomination from Congress and from the President of the United States to be consul to Jerusalem. And it was announced in every newspaper in the United States that he had been elected to this post. Then he went to Jerusalem, and he found out that the Ottoman government would not recognize his American citizenship and would not accept him as the American consul to Jerusalem. And this battle was fought at the highest levels of the American government and the Ottoman government. The ambassador to Constantinople, to Istanbul, you can read his letters to his counterpart in the Ottoman government and the man in the State Department in the United States. trying to say that Arbeely was a legitimate American citizen. He had done his naturalization and that he should be accredited in Jerusalem. But the Ottoman government refused to budge because they considered him still an Ottoman citizen.
So this brings up for those who are dual passport holders, when these people used to go back and forth from, they're naturalized American citizens, they have an American passport, they get to Beirut, they land at the port in Beirut. Are they still Ottoman passport holders? In the 1880s, did passports exist? Were they stamping different documents, or did they have to rescind or sort of?
There were no Ottoman passports. They never came with an Ottoman passport. So there was no actual document. But no, they didn't recognize their American citizenship. And I tell this story, and we were talking about it before, about my grandfather and grandmother, my maternal grandfather and grandmother, who went to Syria in 1914. And of course, 1914 is just the beginnings of the First World War. And the Christians in Lebanon lost their exemption from the military. And so my grandfather was panicked because he was afraid he was going to be drafted into the Ottoman military. He ran from his village, which was Merjayoun, down to Beirut to get a paper from the American consul saying that he was an American citizen. It would not have helped him. If he had been drafted, he would have been considered an Ottoman, but he ran back to Merjayoun, they ran to the next village, and then they came back to the United States, evading what he thought was an imminent threat to him. And many people felt that. Many of the people who were naturalized citizens were afraid to go back during the war for that reason.
Okay. That's a fantastic story. Okay, I'm going to keep on going. I'm going to do our little quick Q&A and then open it up to the questions in the chat. So, and I'll try to keep you to like a very short answers. What are you reading or watching right now, if anything?
Well, because I'm writing a chapter on the Syrian and Ottoman Jews and the Ottoman Christians in New York in the 19th century, I'm reading a lot of books about the Sephardic Jews in New York and also about what it meant to be Ottoman and what it meant to be an Ottoman Jew in the 19th century. So, I mean, I can name all the books I'm reading, but I read 5 at a time, so probably wouldn't be.
Could you name one just as a recommendation?
I have one on my table right here called Jewish Migration to the United States from Ottoman Times to the Present. Great. And I'm also reading a book, this is actually a really fabulous book called Becoming Ottomans by a woman named Julia Phillips Cohen, which is about Ottoman identity versus Jewish identity in the Ottoman Empire. It's really quite fantastic.
Fantastic. So. Okay, great. Second question, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I would like to shadow one of the women that I've profiled in the 19th century and early 20th century. They were fascinating, and I know a lot about them. I know really a lot about them, and yet not enough, because I don't know what their hearts were like, and I don't know what their brains were really like, and I don't know what their personalities were like, and I'd really like to shadow one of them.
Amazing. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
Well, I have to give you an example, I guess, because I gave a talk early on, and then and now I'm writing an actual chapter on it, on the myth and the anti-myth of the Syrian immigrant, using my 2 grandfathers, my paternal grandfather and my maternal grandfather, as the models for the myth and the anti-myth. And I get such a negative reaction from people who do not want to believe that there were, and this word is taboo among the Syrian descendants, failures in the Syrian immigrant or in the Syrian diaspora. And my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a failure, an economic failure, a family failure, an emotional failure. Man, he was not a not a success in any walk of life. And for me to say that out loud evokes lots of negative responses. And we're just people, right? Like everybody else, the bad and the good, the successful, the not successful, the pathetic, the heroic. We're just like everyone else.
Okay, let's do the last one. Whose work do you admire and or are inspired by? I'm sure there's a long list, but if anyone sort of jumps to mind.
Well, Akram Khater, yeah. I mean, the head of the Moisrallah Center. You know, I was just watching his conversation with you, and I admire the work he does, and especially the fact that he is doing social history and is interested in not the movers and shakers, but everybody else, which is what I'm interested in. So I think he's wonderful.
I think so too. Okay, we're going to open it up. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to unmute one by one. Kay, if you're there, you can unmute yourself. I'm going to skip you and go on to Daniel. Daniel.
Hi.
Hey, Daniel. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, really enjoying the talk. I just wanted to ask, I put it in the chat, often the community is sort of contained to Syrian and Lebanese national kind of frameworks. And I'd say Palestinian residents are sort of obscured. I know proportionally the numbers were low, but do you know anything more of an early Palestinian community in New York? And I'm aware of like the what's it called, Forzly, if I'm saying that right.
Sorry, the last thing you said, sorry.
People like Forzly, Abdul Hamid Showman, who I think set up the Arab Bank.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, and groups like the Palestinian National, I forgot his name. Anyway, yeah.
So, yeah, I'm really interested in early Palestinians in the United States, and I wrote a paper actually about the Palestinian presence at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Fair. And because of writing that paper, I've been trying to find Palestinians in the early records. It's quite hard. I mean, you know, sometimes the census takers and people would recognize. So I have a guy that I'm writing about today whose name is Musa Talamas. He's probably Syrian, but he's from Bethlehem. And so what do you call those people? You know, you don't know whether he's a Catholic from Bethlehem or a Maronite Syrian who moved to Bethlehem. It's very hard to know. He's listed in the census as a person from Bethlehem. So one can look for those people, but there are a lot of people who were called Syrians who might have been from Palestine, but who called themselves Syrians or were called Syrians by the census takers. And it's really, really hard in the 19th century in particular. You know, after 67, when people started being more assertive about where they were from and saying that they were from Palestine, it's a lot easier. But up until 67, it's really, really hard, I think, to get at the early Palestinian presence in the United States. I'm still trying, but I'm not there yet.
Okay, great question. Bob asked me to ask his question on his behalf. So can you speak about the cultural and literary production / innovation that came out of the Syrian quarter of New York, Gibran et al.? So yes, the Pen League.
Yes, I can. And I'm sure I know which Bob that is too. Yeah, so, you know, there were a half dozen newspapers that were active in the 19th century and another 50 to 60 Arabic newspapers in the early 20th century. Also out of that literary beginning, that news beginning, there were poems published in all of those newspapers. People like Khalil Gibran, Amin Rehani, Abdul-Masih Haddad, Ilya Abu Mahdi, all of these people had their starts in the newspaper world. And I'm sure everyone knows this, that Afifa Karam, who didn't live in New York, but published her first novel in Arabic in New York in 1904. Amin Rihani published a novel in English in 1911 in New York. And all of these books were published by the Arabic press. And that's because they had the only Arabic typesetters in the United States at that time. So any book that was in Arabic had to be published by the presses. Out of that came the Pen League, the Rabita al-Kalamiyya, which started in 1916 and then was reformulated in 1920, which was a group of 8 or possibly 10 men, all men, who published, among them Khalil Gibran, Elia Abu Mahdi, Amin Rihani, Al-Masih Haddad, many people like that, who published many of the most famous works of those writers in New York. And several of them had newspapers, whether founded early in the 20th century or later, like As-Samir or Al-Funun, those magazines. So there was a very, very active literary, written and spoken literary culture in the Syrian colony, beginning in the 19th century and up until now.
Great. Okay. Let me move on to Lamia, and then if she's Lamia, are you there?
Yes.
Hi, Lamia.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much. It's great to hear you, Linda.
Nice to hear you.
I have a question regarding the sectarian communities and their relation.
Yeah.
You mentioned one incident between, I think, the two Christian communities, but in general, were they would they encounter? Would they have some kind of like relationship? Was it always? I mean, through language, through literature, through different things. That's my first question. And if you have time for a second question, if you don't, it's fine. I understand. What about immigration after World War I? And are you planning to work on 20th century immigration and how it shifted after World War I and the reasons that are behind the immigration and the diaspora?
So I'll answer your second question first. No, I don't, Lamia, because I don't speak and read Arabic well enough, and there's too much written. I can deal with the Arabic production in the 19th century because it's fairly limited, but I can't do the 20th century in good conscience without being able to read Arabic. So that's the answer to your second question. The first question, really a good question, because there was if you look at, for example, business partnerships in the colony, almost always people partnered with people of their same religious bent. So the Maronites worked with the Maronites, the Orthodox worked with the Orthodox. They married each other. There was very little intermarriage. So my paternal grandfather and my paternal grandfather was Maronite and my paternal grandmother was Orthodox. It was extremely rare for that kind of intermarriage to take place in the colony. And my grandmother, who was Orthodox, converted because they would not let her. He wanted her to convert. He didn't have family here, but he did not want her. I mean, to be. He couldn't marry Orthodox without her converting. So, and as I said, in business relationships, they stayed separate. As I said in the beginning, the Arabic newspaper Kawkab was intersectarian at the beginning, but then became more and more sectarian as other newspapers sprang up. And Naum Makarzel, who started Al Huda in Philadelphia in 1898, was kind of the ultimate Maronite spokesperson, and his newspaper was a Maronite organ. So there was a lot of tension among the sects. Some people transcended those sects and some didn't.
Okay. We have just hit the hour. Linda, this was an absolute pleasure to have you on. I feel like I could talk to you for another couple hours about this.
I would be happy. Anytime.
Yeah, maybe we'll have you back to extend the conversation at some point. For those of you who are interested in finding the books, diving into a bunch of the articles, learning more about this, there's a ton on the Kalima Press website. I highly recommend that you do a Google deep dive into this stuff. There's so much out there. Thanks, everybody. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. It's great.